Jake Miller was a quiet man who loved simple things in life. He worked hard during the day, but what he enjoyed most was coming home to his small house in a peaceful neighborhood. What made Jake happiest was the small lake near his house. It wasn't a big lake like the ones you see in movies, but it was perfect for him. The water was calm and clear, surrounded by tall trees that danced gently in the wind. The lake was a place where Jake could forget about all the stress and noise of the world. For many years, Jake had a small routine. After finishing work, he would pack his fishing rod, some bait, and a little cooler with snacks. Then he would walk to the lake, sometimes alone, sometimes with his dog. There he would sit quietly on the wooden dock, watching the water ripple and waiting patiently for a fish to bite. Fishing was more than just a hobby for Jake. It was his way to relax, to breathe, and to feel connected with nature. It gave him peace in a world that often felt rushed and complicated. The neighborhood Jake lived in was calm and friendly. People waved to each other while walking their dogs, and children played safely on the sidewalks. Most of the houses were small and cozy, with gardens full of flowers and vegetables. The community was built around that little lake, and many families liked to spend time there, fishing or just enjoying the view. The lake was like a heart in the neighborhood, quiet, steady, and welcoming. But over time, things began to change. A new homeowners association (HOA) board was elected by the neighborhood. This board was supposed to manage the common areas like the streets and the lake, and keep the neighborhood looking nice and safe. At first, nobody thought much about it. They believed the HOA was there to help, to keep everything organized. But soon, Jake and many others started to notice that the HOA board members were becoming strict. They began making new rules and enforcing old ones more harshly than before. Small things that people used to ignore suddenly became serious problems. Jake didn't mind rules. He understood the need for order, especially in a community where many people lived close to each other. But some of the rules felt unfair and unnecessary. The HOA started fining people for parking a little too long in the street, for putting trash bins out early, or even for trimming their bushes without permission. It felt like the board members were enjoying having control more than actually helping the community. One day, Jake received a letter in his mailbox. The letter was official looking, with the HOA's logo on top. Jake opened it carefully, thinking it might be about a neighborhood meeting or some maintenance work. But when he read it, his heart sank. The letter said that he was being fined for fishing in the lake without permission. The HOA claimed that fishing was now prohibited. Jake couldn't believe it. He had been fishing there for years. No one had ever stopped him before. No one had ever told him that fishing was against the rules. At first, Jake thought it must be a mistake. Maybe someone had reported him by accident, or maybe the HOA had made a wrong judgment. He called the HOA office to ask for an explanation. The person on the phone sounded firm and cold. She said the HOA board had recently introduced new wildlife preservation policies that banned fishing to protect the fish and other animals in the lake. Jake asked if he could see a copy of these policies or discuss the matter with the board, but he was told no. The decision was final, and the fine would stay. Jake felt confused and frustrated. The lake was always a place where people came to relax and enjoy nature. The fish had been there for years, and so had the fishermen. No one had ever complained about fishing harming the lake or its wildlife. The HOA's explanation sounded more like an excuse to Jake. He began to wonder if there was some other reason behind the new rule. A few days later, another letter arrived. This time the fine was bigger. The HOA said that because Jake had not paid the first fine, he now owed double. Jake felt angry, but tried to stay calm. He decided to talk to his neighbors. Maybe they knew more about the new rules, or maybe they had received similar fines. When Jake spoke to some neighbors, he realized he was not alone. Several others had also been fined or warned about fishing. But the mood in the neighborhood was strange. Many people didn't want to talk openly. Some said they were scared of upsetting the HOA. Others said they didn't want to get involved in conflicts. Jake felt isolated. The neighborhood, which once felt like a friendly community, now seemed divided and tense. Determined to understand what was happening, Jake attended the next neighborhood meeting. He hoped to speak directly with the HOA board members and explain his side. At the meeting, he stood up and asked about the fishing rule. He wanted to know why it had been introduced and whether it was really necessary. The board members looked uncomfortable but didn't want to admit any mistake. One of them explained that the HOA had exclusive rights to manage the lake and that fishing was now banned to protect the environment. Jake tried to argue that many people used the lake responsibly and that fishing had never caused problems before, but the board members were not interested in discussion. They said the decision was final and reminded everyone that breaking the rules would lead to more fines or other penalties. Jake left the meeting feeling defeated. That night, Jake lay awake thinking. He wasn't angry just because of the fine. He was angry because it felt like the HOA was taking away something that belonged to the whole community. The lake was more than just water and fish. It was a place of peace and freedom. The HOA's new rules felt like a wall, cutting off people's rights to enjoy their own neighborhood. As Jake thought more about it, an idea started to form in his mind. What if the HOA didn't really own the lake? What if they didn't have the right to stop people from fishing there? Jake had never paid much attention to who actually owned the lake property. He always assumed it was part of the neighborhood, managed by the HOA. But what if that wasn't true? Jake decided to find out. Over the next few days, he visited the local government office to check the property records. It was a slow and confusing process, but Jake was determined. He wanted to know the truth no matter what it was. After some searching, Jake discovered something surprising. The lake was not owned by the HOA or the neighborhood association. Instead, it belonged to a private company based far away in another state. This company had owned the land for many years but had been leasing it informally to the neighborhood. The lease was about to expire soon. This new information changed everything for Jake. It meant that the HOA's authority over the lake was not as strong as they claimed. It also meant that someone could actually buy the lake and take control, away from the HOA. Jake's mind raced with possibilities. What if he could buy the lake himself? For the first time in a long time, Jake felt hope. He was no longer just a homeowner being bullied by the HOA. He was someone with a plan, someone who could take back what had been taken from him. The peaceful fisherman who loved the lake was ready to fight, but in a way no one expected. After discovering that the lake wasn't owned by the HOA but by a private company far away, Jake Miller felt a new sense of hope. This wasn't just a small problem he had to accept. Maybe there was a way to fix it. But before he could act, he needed to understand the full situation better. Jake was a patient and careful man. He didn't want to rush into anything without a clear plan. His first step was to try to reason with the HOA. Maybe, he thought, if he explained the situation, if he showed the truth about the lake's ownership, the HOA would back down. He picked up the phone and called the HOA office again. This time, he asked for a meeting with the board members, hoping to talk face to face. When Jake finally met the board, things were not as easy as he had imagined. The board members were polite but firm. They repeated the same reasons. Fishing was banned because of wildlife preservation and their management rights. When Jake showed them the property records proving the lake was not their property, the board's faces changed. They looked surprised, but they quickly recovered and said the HOA still had certain rights over the lake because it was a common area for residents. Jake listened carefully but felt like the board was hiding something. Their arguments seemed weak, and they avoided answering his questions directly. When Jake suggested reversing the fishing ban, the board refused flatly. They said the decision was final, and that anyone caught fishing would face severe penalties. Feeling frustrated but not defeated, Jake decided to speak with his neighbors. He wanted to find out if anyone else had questioned the HOA or tried to fight the new rules. Jake quickly realized that many neighbors were unhappy, but most were too scared to stand up. The HOA had built a reputation for being strict and unforgiving. People whispered about friends who had been fined or threatened with legal action for small rule breaks. Jake also found out that many people didn't fully understand the HOA's powers or the legal rights around the lake. There was confusion about who really owned the lake, what the HOA could do, and what the residents' rights were. This confusion worked in the HOA's favor. It kept people quiet and afraid. Jake began to think about how fear and confusion were powerful tools for control. The HOA's strategy wasn't just about rules. It was about making people feel powerless. But Jake was determined not to be one of those people. To fight this, Jake started researching everything he could about HOA laws, property rights, and lakeside ownership. He spent hours reading legal documents, watching videos, and even consulting a local lawyer who specialized in property disputes. The lawyer told Jake that if the lake was privately owned and not officially part of the neighborhood's common areas, the HOA might not have the right to ban fishing at all. This was encouraging news. But the lawyer also warned Jake that fighting the HOA would be difficult. HOAs often had deep pockets and were skilled at using rules and legal processes to their advantage. They could drag things out for months or even years, making it expensive and exhausting for anyone who challenged them. Jake wasn't worried about the money or time. What mattered most to him was standing up for what was right. He was ready for a long fight, but he also wanted to find a way to win quickly and decisively. One day, as Jake sat by the lake thinking about his next move, he had a bold idea. If the lake belonged to a private company, what if he bought it? What if he became the owner himself? That way, he could decide who could fish or use the lake, not the HOA. The idea felt almost too good to be true. Buying the lake was expensive, but Jake remembered he had saved money over the years. He had put aside extra funds from his job and from small side projects. The thought of using that money for something so meaningful gave him energy. Jake reached out to the private company that owned the lake. He made a few phone calls, wrote emails, and finally got in touch with the person in charge of the land. To his surprise, the company was interested in selling. They had no plans to keep the property and were glad to find a buyer. Negotiations began. Jake learned about the costs, the paperwork, and the legal process. It wasn't easy. There were many forms to fill, inspections to arrange, and contracts to sign. But Jake was persistent. He wanted the lake, not just for himself, but for the whole community, or at least for those who respected it. Meanwhile, the HOA continued to enforce its rules. Jake got more letters from them, some warning of larger fines. He ignored them, knowing he was preparing for something bigger. At neighborhood meetings, the tension grew. People whispered about Jake's growing challenge to the HOA. Some neighbors admired him quietly, while others saw him as a troublemaker. Despite the pressure, Jake stayed focused. He kept fishing in secret, enjoying his time by the lake and dreaming of the day he would officially own it. The idea of finally reclaiming the lake from the HOA's control gave him strength. During this time, Jake also tried to build support. He talked to neighbors who trusted him, explaining his plan and encouraging them to stand up with him. He knew that having a community behind him would be important for the next steps. As weeks turned into months, Jake's purchase of the lake became more real. The legal work progressed, and the company agreed to sell the land to him. Jake signed the final papers and became the official owner of the lake. It was a moment of victory and relief. Owning the lake changed everything. Jake no longer had to worry about HOA fines when he fished. He had control over the land and could decide the rules. But Jake wasn't interested in revenge just for the sake of it. He wanted to make sure the lake stayed a place of peace and respect. However, Jake knew the story was not over. The HOA was powerful, and they might try to challenge his ownership. He was ready to face whatever came next. This part of Jake's journey was about standing up to unfairness, learning about his rights, and finding strength in knowledge and determination. It showed that sometimes when people feel powerless, they just need to find the right information and have the courage to act. After months of careful planning, Jake Miller's hard work was finally paying off. He had uncovered a secret that changed everything about the fight with the Homeowners Association. The lake near his home, once thought to be controlled by the HOA, was actually private property owned by a company from another state. This discovery gave Jake a new sense of power and hope, but also meant he had to take bold steps that would change his life and the neighborhoods forever. Jake was a man of patience and determination. He didn't rush into decisions without understanding all the details. The news about the lake's ownership was exciting, but it was only the beginning. Now Jake had to turn this information into action. He knew that if he wanted to protect his right to fish and enjoy the lake, he would have to become the owner himself. For years, Jake had watched the lake quietly from the dock, the water shimmering under the sunlight, the trees reflecting gently on the surface. It had been his sanctuary, a place where he found peace after long, tiring days. But that peace had been threatened by the HOA's sudden rules and fines. The HOA claimed they had the right to control who used the lake, even fining Jake for fishing there. The feeling of injustice had grown deep inside him. Now, with the knowledge that the HOA's control was only an illusion, Jake saw a path to real freedom. If he could buy the lake from the company that owned it, he could set his own rules. Rules that made sense and respected the people who cared for the place. It was a bold idea, but Jake was ready. Jake began by contacting the company that owned the lake. It was a large corporation with offices in a distant state, and dealing with them wasn't easy. The company had no interest in managing the lake anymore. It had been leased informally to the neighborhood for years. But the lease was ending soon, and the company was looking to sell the property. When Jake reached out, he was surprised by how interested they were in selling the land quickly. Negotiations began slowly. Jake was not a wealthy man, and buying a piece of land, even a small lake, was expensive. But he had saved money over the years, and he was ready to use it for something that meant a lot to him. Jake carefully worked through every detail, learning about the legal process, contracts, and costs involved. He asked questions, took advice from a local lawyer, and made sure everything was done properly. The community around him started to notice Jake's determination. Some neighbors were curious, others skeptical, and a few quietly supported him. The HOA, however, was unaware of Jake's moves. They continued to enforce the fishing ban, sending letters and warnings to those who fished or even came near the lake. Meanwhile, Jake stayed calm and focused. He still fished quietly, but he was preparing for a bigger moment, the moment when he would become the owner of the lake. When that day came, everything would change. During this time, Jake learned that buying the lake was not just about money. It was about responsibility. He would have to manage the property, maintain the lake, and make decisions that affected the entire neighborhood. It was a big task, but Jake felt ready. The idea of turning the lake into a place of respect and freedom motivated him more than anything else. Finally, after months of waiting and paperwork, the day arrived. Jake signed the final documents. He was officially the owner of the lake. The feeling was incredible. He held the papers in his hands, knowing that he had taken control from the HOA's tight grip. Owning the lake gave Jake power, but also a new challenge. He had to decide how to use this power wisely. He didn't want to cause more conflict or hurt the community. Instead, he wanted to protect the lake and make it a place where everyone could enjoy nature, on his terms. The news of Jake's purchase spread quickly. When the HOA board found out, they were shocked. They had never expected Jake to take such a bold step. The board sent letters demanding explanations, trying to intimidate him, but Jake had the legal papers. They couldn't argue with facts. Jake, however, remained calm. He put up signs around the lake announcing it was private property. He explained to neighbors what his plans were and invited respectful use of the lake. Some neighbors were angry, feeling excluded. Others were grateful that the lake was no longer controlled by the HOA. Through this whole process, Jake learned important lessons about courage, patience, and standing up for what is right. The fight was not just about fishing, it was about fairness and respect in a community that had been divided by power struggles. Jake's story became an inspiration to others facing similar challenges. It showed how knowledge and determination could help one person change the rules and take control of their own life. The quiet fisherman had become a leader, proving that sometimes standing up to unfairness means thinking big and acting boldly. After Jake Miller became the official owner of the lake, the neighborhood was buzzing with mixed reactions. Some neighbors were quietly impressed by his determination, while others were upset, confused, or angry. Jake had taken control from the HOA, An organization that many residents had long trusted or feared. Suddenly, the quiet neighborhood felt different. Tense, unpredictable, and filled with new questions about power and fairness. Jake knew owning the lake wasn't just about holding a piece of land. It was about responsibility. He had to think carefully about what to do next. The lake was a shared treasure, a place where many families had memories of fishing, swimming, or sitting quietly by the water. But the HOA had caused division by trying to control the lake with strict rules and unfair fines. Jake wanted to fix that. He wanted the lake to be a place of peace and respect, but on his terms. He also wanted to send a clear message to the HOA. They could no longer use fear and rules to bully the neighborhood. Jake was ready to show that power could be used differently. To start, Jake decided to set new rules for the lake. These rules were simple, but firm. He wanted to protect the environment and keep the lake safe for everyone who respected it. But he also wanted to make sure people who disrespected the space or caused trouble would not be allowed. The most shocking rule Jake introduced was that the HOA and its members were no longer allowed on the lake or its banks. After all, the HOA had tried to control the lake unfairly and fined people for enjoying a peaceful activity like fishing. Jake felt it was time for them to face the consequences. At first, many neighbors were surprised and some were upset by Jake's decision to ban the HOA. The HOA board members themselves were furious. They sent letters demanding access, threatening legal action and trying to convince neighbors to oppose Jake. But Jake stood firm. He had the legal rights, and he was ready to defend them. Some neighbors wondered if Jake was being too harsh. After all, they thought the HOA did help with other neighborhood issues like street cleaning, landscaping, and security. But Jake believed that the HOA had crossed a line by punishing innocent people for simple fishing, a tradition for many years. Jake began patrolling the lake more often. He installed signs warning that the lake was private property and that the HOA was banned. He also spoke with neighbors individually, explaining his reasons and asking for support. Slowly, people started understanding Jake's side. They saw that his actions were not about personal revenge, but about standing up to unfair power. One day, a group of HOA board members showed up at the lake trying to fish and take back control. Jake was there to meet them. He calmly explained that the lake was now private property and that they were not welcome. The HOA members argued, saying they had a duty to manage the lake for the community. Jake replied that managing meant respecting people, not punishing them. The confrontation was tense but peaceful. Jake's confidence and calmness surprised the HOA members. They realized they no longer had control and that Jake was serious. The HOA left without causing trouble, but the neighborhood felt the weight of the conflict. Meanwhile, Jake continued to maintain the lake carefully. He worked with a few neighbors who wanted to help keep the water clean and safe. They organized small cleanup days and planted trees along the banks. The lake began to look better than ever, and people slowly started to visit again, feeling safe and welcome. The story of Jake buying the lake and banning the HOA spread beyond the neighborhood. Local newspapers picked up the story, and Jake was interviewed about his fight. Many people admired his courage and determination. His story became a symbol of standing up against unfair authority and fighting for what is right. Jake also faced challenges. The HOA did not give up easily. They looked for legal loopholes, contacted lawyers, and tried to pressure neighbors to support them. Jake had to stay strong and keep fighting, but he was no longer alone. Some neighbors began to stand with him, realizing that fairness and respect were more important than fear and control. Through all this, Jake learned valuable lessons about leadership, courage, and community. He understood that standing up for what is right could be difficult and lonely at times, but it was also necessary. His fight wasn't just about fishing or a lake. It was about people's rights to enjoy their homes and neighborhoods without being bullied. In the end, Jake's story showed that sometimes change comes from unexpected places. A quiet fisherman, with a simple love for nature, could become a hero by believing in fairness and standing up for his community. His victory was not just his own. It belonged to everyone who had ever felt powerless, but refused to give up. The battle between Jake Miller and the Homeowners Association had been going on for months. and now it was reaching its final chapter. After Jake bought the lake and banned the entire HOA from accessing it, tensions ran high. Some neighbors were divided. Some sided with Jake, feeling he was protecting their rights, while others still supported the HOA, believing it was necessary to keep order in the community. Jake knew this fight was bigger than just the lake or fishing. It was about control, fairness, and respect. Jake's decision to ban the HOA was bold, maybe even risky. But he stood by it. He believed that power should come with responsibility and respect, and the HOA had abused both. The HOA had fined people unfairly, bullied neighbors, and tried to control something that wasn't even theirs. Jake wanted to show that such behavior would no longer be accepted. At the same time, Jake understood the importance of community. He wasn't interested in creating more problems or dividing neighbors permanently. He wanted the lake to be a place where people could come together, enjoy nature, and relax. But that could only happen if respect was mutual. After officially owning the lake, Jake focused on making it a better place. He organized neighborhood cleanups, encouraged families to enjoy the water, and promoted fishing and other outdoor activities. Jake believed the lake should be a symbol of freedom, not fear. But the HOA wasn't ready to give up. They challenged Jake's ownership in court, trying to claim that the lake was still a community asset. They argued that Jake's purchase was invalid and that they had rights to the lake's management. The legal battle was stressful and expensive, but Jake didn't back down. Throughout the court case, Jake gathered evidence showing that the lake had always been privately owned by the company he bought it from. He had contracts, land records, and expert witnesses. Jake also had the support of neighbors who believed in his cause. The courtroom became a battleground. The HOA's lawyers tried to paint Jake as a troublemaker who wanted to shut out the community. But Jake calmly told his story, how the HOA had fined him unfairly for fishing, how they had misused power, and how he wanted the lake to be open to all who respected it. The judge listened carefully. After weeks of hearings, the court finally made a decision. Jake was recognized as the rightful owner of the lake. The HOA had no legal claim to control or ban anyone from the property. This was a huge victory for Jake and for those who believed in fairness. After the ruling, Jake didn't gloat or celebrate loudly. Instead, he reached out to the community with a message of unity. He invited all neighbors to come and enjoy the lake peacefully, promising fair rules that everyone could agree on. Some HOA members accepted the invitation, realizing that fighting Jake was no longer useful. Others remained distant, unwilling to change their views. But the neighborhood slowly began to heal. Jake continued to manage the lake with care and fairness. He set simple rules: no littering, respect the wildlife, and be kind to others. He encouraged fishing, swimming, and family picnics. The lake became a place of joy and relaxation once again. As months passed, the neighborhood's atmosphere improved. People started talking and working together more. The fear and tension caused by the HOA's strict rules began to fade. Families enjoyed weekends by the water, kids learned to fish, and neighbors shared stories and laughter. Jake's story inspired many others beyond his neighborhood. News about his fight against the HOA spread online and in local media. People saw how one person's courage and determination could challenge unfair power structures. Jake became a symbol of standing up for what is right, even when the odds seemed against you. But Jake never saw himself as a hero. He was just someone who loved fishing and wanted to enjoy the lake peacefully. He hoped his story would encourage others to know their rights and stand up when something is wrong. Looking back, Jake realized the journey had taught him more than just property law or neighborhood politics. It had taught him about patience, courage, and the importance of community. He had learned that change often takes time, and that true leadership means listening, understanding, and standing firm when it matters most. In the end, Jake's victory was not just about the lake or fishing. It was about respect. Respect for people, for nature, and for fairness. It was about showing that no one should be bullied or silenced just because they care about their home. Jake continued to live by the lake, enjoying the peaceful waters and the company of neighbors who had come to trust him. The lake was no longer just a place to fish. It was a symbol of hope, courage, and community. And so the story of Jake Miller reminds us all, sometimes the quietest voices, armed with truth and courage, can make the biggest difference.